Thank you. Our final speaker for the first session is Hugh Whittall.
That's it.
Is that
Thank
correct?
you.
Okay. Who is the director of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I have a few slides. I really, just because I want to leave the last one hanging there when I finish. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to attend on behalf of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and present at this important workshop. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics, I might just say, is an independent body. We are funded by the Wellcome Trust, the Nuffield Foundation and the UK Medical Research Council. The job of the Council is to identify and examine ethical issues arising out of developments in biological and medical research, to promote public discussion, and to make reports and policy recommendations. And so it was in 2012 that we published a report on new techniques for the prevention of mitochondrial DNA disorders. This is the report on which my remarks will be based. The report was prepared, initially we convened a working group with people with, not totally unlike this one maybe, people with scientific, medical, philosophical and ethical expertise, as well as lay interests. The group consulted widely and the work passed through the full council, which scrutinised and adopted the report. The aim that we had at that time was to support public debate around an issue that was already in the process of policy consideration and which engaged a good number of other actors. There have been technical safety evaluation reports, public consultations and parliamentary debates in the UK. And what we wanted to do was to provide a platform for consideration of the ethical issues as part of those wider discussions. It's important to be aware that in the UK, all of this takes place within an environment where all IVF-related treatment and research is closely regulated. I will start, if I may, with the conclusion, which is that we concluded that it would be ethical for people to use these techniques if they are shown to be sufficiently safe and effective, and if families are properly informed about the status and possible implications and outcomes of the procedures. Our recommendations included other conditions, Tom touched on some of these, about the need for licensing and regulation, the structure for which is in place in the UK, for the procedures to be conducted within specialist clinical research environments, and for all cases to be included in long-term follow-up studies. In arriving at this point, the Council took head-on a number of the tough questions that we've already started to talk about. I'll go through these very briefly in a kind of scene-setting way, and I hope we'll talk about them more later over the course of the next couple of days. First question, is the use of embryos problematic? Well, I've said already that in the UK there has been legislation and a regulatory system in place. It's been there since 1991. It covers areas of gamete donation, IVF and embryo research, and the creation and use of embryos for fertility treatment and for the avoidance of serious disease and for connected research purposes has been permitted since that time. So the kind of procedures and purposes that we're now contemplating would be an extension of those, but would sit comfortably alongside the range of uses of embryos that have long been permitted, albeit regulated. So we've taken as a starting point that the creation and use of embryos in this context is not intrinsically problematic. Some people, we've heard already, would favour MST over PNT for what they would see as important moral reasons. But we would regard both of those as, in a sense, equally controversial or uncontroversial in that respect. And in what follows, I will refer to them together. Which one gets used in practice is simply going to be a question of which is shown to be more effective. The second point raised is about genetic modification. Is this genetic modification? Well, it is difficult to find an agreed or stable definition of genetic modification, and on some interpretations it would be so. It would be a genetic modification. It's perhaps, however, just as relevant or more relevant to note that with these techniques no genes are being modified or altered but are being replaced. And in any event, the moral issue is not about whether it constitutes GM. In our view, GM is not morally right or wrong per se. The question should not be about the particular process, but about the intention and the effect. Is it a germline intervention? Well, it's a germline intervention in that the effect of the intervention will be inherited by future generations through the maternal line. Again, as with the GM question, this does not in itself take it off limits. The question should not be, is this a germline intervention, but is this a reasonable step to take in these circumstances? And that does not mean that all interventions affecting the germline are acceptable, as each case should be considered. But what is the procedure? What is its purpose? Its likely effect? And the one germline effect that we know that the procedure is most likely to have is to enable families to be freed of the inheritance of and the future anxiety about serious mitochondrial disease. And this surely speaks in its favour. Does the procedure affect identity? Well, the question here might be, is the identity of this individual, if born, different to that of the person who would otherwise have been born? And you can look at this in a number of ways, whether it's about self-conception, genetic identity, numerical identity, a qualitative identity. In that sense, yes, it could be said to affect identity. If the question is, has the identity of any individual been changed, then the answer is surely no. Certainly we would not regard the embryo at a pronuclear stage as a person. The procedure simply bring about a person with this identity rather than a slightly different one. Now, our report examines these questions in greater detail. I'd be happy if you can take the time to read it. But in short, to the extent that the difference in identity is that the individual born following this procedure is one without mitochondrial disease, then from a moral point of view, this must be a positive feature. Are we creating children with three parents? Well, put simply, it makes no sense from a social, biological or legal point of view to refer to a third parent. Families are increasingly constructed in many different ways, and whilst genetic connections are important for many people, kinship is a predominantly social construction which can change over time. Again, we discuss this at some length in the report. But the important elements of what makes a person a parent are not really engaged in respect of the donor of mitochondria. The donor whose mitochondria are used is not equivalent to a full egg donor, and there's no reason to treat them in law as such. Now, of course, families might choose to establish or retain links between the donor, the child, and the recipient family, but that is not an issue that calls for state intervention. How can we know whether it is safe? Well, like any new medical intervention, we cannot have absolute certainty or guarantees of absolute safety. As with other novel interventions, this is a matter for judgment within a well-established frame of scientific discovery and progress. We know that earlier ARTs have been less well researched before introduction, and we know that other treatments, whether radiotherapy or chemotherapy, for example, can have potential germline implications one way or another. Well, in this case, in the UK, there have now been 3 specific independent scientific reviews evaluating the evidence of safety and effectiveness. I cannot say whether they're now ready to go, and I'm not qualified to do that, but the research and evaluation will rightly continue. But what we can say, or what we can never do, is to say that a new procedure must wait until it has been proven to be totally risk-free. We're familiar with the notion of that kind of strict application of the precautionary principle, and we reject it. Rather, we favour a precautionary approach in which new interventions are considered in light of all the evidence and of the alternatives, including the alternative of doing nothing. And none of these are morally neutral. In this case, retaining the status quo means that children and families continue to be affected by the reality of and the anxiety about inherited mitochondrial disorders. Cautious advance with appropriate monitoring is surely a better way to proceed. Are there implications for other future germline interventions? Well, there are other discussions to be had about other potential germline interventions, but the techniques that we're addressing here and the conclusions that we have reached in relation to them are limited in their scope and application to interventions that replace mitochondria in order to prevent the transmission of these diseases. The regulatory scheme in the UK is capable of circumscribing techniques and purposes that may be allowed, so this is not opening a gateway to interventions in the nucleus. Indeed, in fact, we noted in our report, in almost the final line, that while the scope of this inquiry is limited to these particular interventions and purposes, a fresh public debate will be needed in respect of other prospective techniques that might act on the nuclear genome. It may be that the time for that debate is approaching, and given other different technologies, CRISPR has already been mentioned, that debate is needed now. It may be that these discussions will help frame that, but there's no reason to suppose that the acceptance of one has an immediate bearing on the acceptability of another altogether different set of techniques, ones that are different in their methodology, their intention, and their effect. So, finally, I will restate the conclusion, really. Our report goes into more detail on all of these issues, and there has been extensive public debate in the UK, all of which is fully documented. Indeed, this has been regarded by many as an outstanding model of the public policy process in a sensitive area of science and medicine. So the conclusion that we reached in 2012, and which I'm happy to restate now, is that if they are shown to be sufficiently safe and effective, if they are carefully regulated, it would be ethical to offer these techniques to affected families in order to prevent serious inherited disorders being passed on to future generations. Or to put it another way, there is not sufficient reason to prevent such families making use of these procedures if they are appropriately counselled and informed. Thank you.